A gentle dog was found tied up in the woods. What the ranger discovered left him horrified. He wasn't barking, he was whimpering. Alone, tied to a tree, in the middle of the forest. No tags, no tracks, no one around. But when the old man leaned in to check the dog's collar, he saw a military ID, and the name engraved on it was someone he hadn't heard in 15 years. Who left this golden retriever out here? And what kind of pain makes a soldier abandon his only friend? Would you walk away or follow the trail into the past? Willow Creek National Forest, nestled just beyond the quiet town of Pine Grove, Oregon, was draped in the soft hush of early November. The morning mist clung to the ground like a memory refusing to fade, curling gently around the roots of centuries-old Douglas firs and seeping into every crevice of the forest floor. A chill hung in the air, not bitter but present enough to bite at exposed skin. Frost glistened on fallen leaves, and the scent of damp earth mixed with the crispness of pine and decaying foliage. It was the kind of day that promised solitude, the kind Dan Carter used to cherish. Dan was a man in his late 60s, with weathered hands, deep-set eyes the color of river stones, and a posture that bore the invisible weight of someone who'd carried too much loss. Once tall and strong, his frame had narrowed with time, but his step remained steady. A retired forest rescuer, he still wore his old uniform coat, faded green canvas, patched in places but clean, neatly buttoned and respected. His silver beard was kept short, and his gray hair swept back with a kind of unconscious discipline. Dan was known around Pine Grove as the quiet one with the kind eyes. After his wife passed 5 years ago in a car accident, and his daughter and son-in-law were lost in a plane crash 2 years later, he withdrew from town life, choosing the woods and his old log cabin over human company, save for his 12-year-old granddaughter, Ellie. This morning, Dan was walking one of the lesser-used trails near Cold Hollow, a northern corner of Willow Creek known for its thick underbrush and trickling springs. He carried his walking stick, more of a habit than a necessity, and moved in rhythm with the sounds of the forest. A jay's call, the gentle gurgle of the nearby stream, the faint rustle of deer foraging in the brush. He wasn't hunting, only checking the trail markers after the last rainstorm. The forest was familiar to him, more so than any town street or grocery aisle. As he approached a bend near Willow Hollow, he stopped abruptly. A sound, faint, strained, tugged at his ears. Not the rustling of wildlife, not the crack of a twig or splash of water. It was soft, almost hesitant, a whimper, then silence. Dan stilled, his ears sharpening like an old hound's. He stepped carefully off the trail, boots muffled by damp leaves, and followed the sound through the underbrush. After a few yards, the whimper came again, followed by the clinking of metal. Dan pushed through a curtain of blackberry brambles and nearly stumbled upon the source. There, tied to the base of a moss-covered cedar tree with a fraying nylon rope, was a golden retriever. The dog looked up weakly, its honey gold coat tangled and matted, clinging in clumps from days of cold and rain. Ribs showed clearly beneath the once proud chest, and its paws were red and cracked from walking on rough terrain. Its eyes, wide, a deep amber, held an eerie mix of fear and relief, as if it couldn't decide whether Dan was savior or threat. But there was no growl, no bark, only that quiet whimper again. Dan knelt slowly, his joints creaking with the motion, and whispered, "Hey there, buddy. Easy now." The retriever didn't move, only watched him. Dan gently set his stick aside and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a few pieces of leftover turkey jerky. He placed them on the ground and backed up slightly. The dog looked at the food, then at Dan, and with an almost reluctant grace, crawled forward and ate, never taking its eyes off him. That's when Dan saw it, a dull glint near the dog's neck. a small, scratched metal tag, almost swallowed in the matted fur. He leaned in, squinting as he brushed dirt and tangled hair away. Cooper, it read. Beneath the name were a string of numbers, a military ID. Dan's breath hitched. He stared at the tag for a moment longer and then sat back on his heels. The mist had begun to lift slightly, letting fractured sunlight spill onto the forest floor. It dappled the retriever's coat, revealing patches of golden silk beneath the grime. Cooper. Dan reached forward slowly and placed his hand near the rope. I'm going to get you out of here, he said softly. The dog remained still, watching him. As Dan began working the knot, one he recognized as a field hitch used in rescue operations, something inside him stirred. This dog hadn't just been abandoned, someone trained had left him, and someone trained hadn't come back. As he untied the rope, Dan noticed bruising along the dog's hind leg and small cuts that looked several days old. But the dog didn't whine or struggle. He merely waited. You're a good boy, Dan whispered. We'll get you taken care of. Cooper rose slowly, legs shaking, and leaned his weight against Dan's side. That simple act of trust hit Dan harder than he expected. He stood with effort, wrapping one arm around the dog's torso, supporting him as they started walking back to the trail. Back home, at the edge of Willow Creek, Ellie Carter sat on the floor of the old log cabin's front room, laptop open, headphones on, but eyes distant. She had straight chestnut hair tied into a loose ponytail, freckles scattered across her pale cheeks, and wore a threadbare green hoodie that once belonged to her mother. A sketchbook lay beside her, filled with drawings of animals, mostly dogs, and beneath them, lines from her private journal. She was supposed to be attending her virtual history class, but instead, she was writing a new entry in her diary. I don't need a million friends, just one. One who listens without interrupting. One who knows how to sit in silence and still feel close. Maybe one day, he'll come. She didn't know it yet, but that friend was stumbling toward her at that very moment, held up by an old man with a tired heart and a second chance in his hands. The sky above Pine Grove had shifted into its late autumn mood, low-hanging clouds blanketing the horizon, casting a pewter glow over the quiet town. By the time Dan pulled his weather-beaten truck into the gravel driveway of his log cabin, the sun had all but disappeared behind a screen of slate-colored mist. A thin drizzle began to fall, darkening the cedar siding of the house and sending steam rising from the truck's warm hood. Cooper lay curled on a thick old quilt Dan had folded in the back seat, his breathing steady but shallow, his head resting on his paws. Inside the cabin, Ellie Carter sat cross-legged at the kitchen table, sketching in her notebook by the light of a flickering oil lamp. The power had flickered twice already that afternoon, a common hiccup in Pine Grove once the damp cold set in. Ellie, now in her flannel pajamas, had given up on her online school assignments and turned instead to drawing. Her fingers were smudged with pencil lead, and the page in front of her showed the figure of a dog, with soft rounded ears and kind eyes. She didn't hear the truck until the front door creaked open. Dan stepped in with a grunt, pushing the door closed with his shoulder. His arms cradled a bundle wrapped in an old gray towel. Grandpa Ellie blinked, setting her pencil down. She hadn't seen him bring home so much as a houseplant in years. What's that? Dan lowered the bundle gently onto the thick braided rug by the fireplace. It's a dog, he said, simply removing the towel. Found him out past Cold Hollow, tied to a cedar. Ellie stared. Cooper looked up at her with calm amber eyes as if he already knew her name. His coat was still matted and dull, but the firelight caught flecks of gold under the dirt. A dog, she echoed, stunned. You brought home a dog. Dan nodded and squatted beside Cooper, offering him a bowl of water. His name's Cooper. At least that's what his tag says. Ellie stepped closer, her bare feet quiet on the wood floor. Can I pet him? Gently, Dan murmured. As her fingers touched Cooper's head, the dog exhaled softly, leaning slightly into her hand. That was all the permission she needed. She sat down beside him, cross-legged, whispering little things. Hi, Cooper. I'm Ellie. You're safe here. Dan, meanwhile, pulled the metal tag from his coat pocket. He had removed it carefully during the drive. It wasn't a standard dog license. The weight of it in his hand told him so. It was a military tag, etched with more than just a name. Alongside Cooper were a string of numbers and a secondary code he recognized as part of the Army's therapeutic canine program. A memory stirred something about therapy dogs used with soldiers suffering from PTSD, the kind of dogs trained not just to obey, but to observe, to comfort, to sense. He walked into the kitchen and picked up the old rotary phone mounted to the wall. After a pause, he dialed a number from memory. On the third ring, a woman's voice answered. "More veterinary clinic? Helen speaking?" Dan exhaled into the receiver. "It's Dan." There was a pause, then warmth. "Dan Carter. As I live and breathe. I was starting to think you'd gone fully feral out there. Feels like it some days," he said with a small smile. "I've got a dog. Found him tied up in the woods, malnourished, but he's calm. He's not ordinary, Helen." On the other end, Helen Moore sat straighter. She was in her early 50s with a lean, no-nonsense build and eyes that rarely missed a thing. Her hair was pinned up under a patterned bandana, her hands stained from tending to animals all day. Helen had once been a military veterinarian working with canine units overseas. She knew the signs. "What's not ordinary?" she asked. Dan described the tag, the dog's temperament, the location. "Bring him in tomorrow morning," she said. "First light. I want to see him. Sounds like you've got yourself a working dog. And if I'm right, he's not just any therapy animal." Back in the living room, Ellie had draped a throw blanket over Cooper. He hadn't moved much, but his tail gave the occasional thump on the floor. She looked up as Dan returned. "Can we keep him?" Dan hesitated. He looked at Cooper, at Ellie's hopeful face. Something in him loosened. "For now," he said. "We'll see what the vet says." Ellie smiled and turned back to Cooper. "You hear that? You've got at least one night in a warm house. Lucky boy." Later that evening, after Ellie had gone to bed and the fire burned low, Dan sat alone with Cooper by the hearth. The dog's breathing had evened out. Dan studied him, his scars, his steadiness. A protector even in silence. Someone had trained him well, someone had trusted him deeply, and someone had left him behind. The following morning arrived pale and thin with fog hugging the roads like a memory reluctant to let go. Dan Carter stood by the truck, brushing frost off the windshield, as the engine idled low and steady. Cooper sat in the passenger seat, his head resting against the door, watching the world without blinking. His coat was a little cleaner now, brushed gently by Ellie the night before, and though he still walked with caution, his eyes seemed more alert, like a soldier waking from a long rest. Dan adjusted his jacket collar and glanced toward the house. Ellie, wrapped in her navy school sweater, gave a quick wave through the window before turning back to her laptop. Her school day had just begun, but she'd asked to read with Cooper at the library after. He'd agreed. After dropping Cooper off at Dr. Helen Moore's clinic for some lab work and observation, Dan drove into the center of Pine Grove. The town was still stirring bakery smells drifting out of Betty's diner, postmen sorting mail, and pine needles gathering in the gutters. Dan turned onto Maple Row and parked outside the small white-bricked building that served as the Pine Grove Sheriff's Office. He stepped inside the door, creaking against its stiff hinges. Sheriff Cole Abrams was already at his desk, a cup of steaming black coffee in hand, and an open notebook in front of him. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and tired eyes softened by years of community service. His brown uniform shirt was always neatly pressed, though the silver in his beard betrayed how long he'd been wearing it. Cole was known for being firm but fair, and for never rushing judgment. Dan nodded in greeting. "Morning, Cole." The sheriff looked up, then leaned back in his chair. "Well, I'll be." Dan Carter walks into my office without a forest fire behind him. Dan cracked a small grin. "Close enough?" "Got a question about someone." He explained everything. Finding Cooper tied to a tree, the military tag, the odd knot in the rope, and the sense that this wasn't some ordinary abandonment. When he finished, Cole rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Last week," Cole said, standing up and walking to the file cabinet, "got a call from a couple of hikers. Said they saw a man wandering near Willow Creek. Tall fella, hooded jacket, carrying something heavy, looked lost, maybe drunk. When they tried to approach, he vanished into the trees, left no sign." He pulled out a thin file and dropped it on the desk. Didn't think much of it. No crime, just strange behavior. "But, now with your story," Dan tapped the edge of the file. "Could be connected. Could be," Cole said. "I'll send Deputy Harmon to take a second look. In the meantime, I'll see if anything comes up under that tag number. You got a photo of it?" Dan reached into his coat pocket and handed over the scribbled details he'd copied from Cooper's collar. Cole scanned it, then frowned. This format, definitely military, but the prefix looks like one used for therapeutic units. I'll put in a request to the VA registry. Might take a day or two. Dan nodded. I'll wait. They stood in silence for a moment, both men weighed down by unspoken things, loss duty, what it meant to find something broken and feel called to fix it. Then Cole clapped a hand on Dan's shoulder. Keep me posted. All right, you've got my cell. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the bright gold of sunlit maples and the blue ridge beyond the town's edge. Dan drove back to Helen's clinic to retrieve Cooper, who was now clean fed and even wagging his tail a little when he saw Dan approach. Helen gave a brief report, some inflammation, mild dehydration, but no fractures or major internal issues. More importantly, Cooper had demonstrated remarkable calmness during examination, even resting his head on her assistant's lap without being prompted. He's been trained not just to obey, Dan, she said. He reads people, responds to stress cues. This dog was part of someone's healing. Dan's jaw tightened, someone who needed healing bad enough to let go of the one thing trying to help him. Later that afternoon, Ellie walked briskly beside Cooper, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the leash held tightly in her other hand. The Pine Grove Public Library sat quietly beneath the shadow of two ancient sycamores, its red brick face giving it the air of an old train station. Inside, the space was warm, lined with oak shelves and the scent of paper and time. Children gathered around story corners while adults murmured at computer stations or flipped through dog-eared novels. Ellie guided Cooper to the large reading room where a woman stood sorting donated books. Martha Bell was in her 70s, petite but spry, with shoulder-length white hair pinned back in a soft twist. She wore rimless glasses and a cable-knit cardigan peppered with tiny hand-stitched violets. Martha had once served as an army nurse during the Gulf War and carried herself with a quiet dignity shaped by loss and resilience. She'd returned to Pine Grove after retirement and spent her mornings volunteering at the library, her afternoons tending her herb garden, and her evenings sipping mint tea while writing letters she never mailed. Ellie Martha greeted warmly, her voice the kind that seemed designed to calm troubled waters. "And who's this dashing gentleman? This is—" "Cooper," Ellie said, puffing with pride. "We found him in the woods. Grandpa says he's special." Martha knelt slowly, offering her hand. Cooper sniffed it, then nudged gently into her palm. "Oh my," she murmured. "There's a steadiness in him, like he's waiting for someone to fall apart so he can keep them together." Ellie blinked. "That's kind of exactly what he does." Martha chuckled softly, rising with care. "I knew dogs like that, back when I served. We had a therapy shepherd named Nero. He could stop a panic attack with a nudge. I've seen men weep just holding his paw." Ellie sat with Cooper at her feet as Martha told more stories about therapy dogs on overseas bases, about the silent comfort they offered in moments too raw for words. Ellie listened, eyes wide, as if hearing a language she already understood but never knew how to speak. That night, after dinner, Ellie opened her sketchbook again. She drew Cooper's eyes, then just above his head she added the shape of a hand, gentle, strong reaching. She didn't know whose hand it was, but she knew the story wasn't over. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the trees when Dan received the call. Sheriff Cole's voice was low, taut with quiet urgency. "We found something. A hunting cabin deep near the northwest ridge, no clear path in or out. Looks like someone's been living there off-grid." Dan was already grabbing his jacket before Cole finished the sentence. He loaded Cooper into the truck again, the golden retriever now visibly stronger than when he'd first appeared, though still cautious, still listening more than acting. Cooper didn't bark, often didn't seek out attention. But when Dan opened the truck door, Cooper climbed in without a word, as if he already knew where they were going. They reached the forest's edge by late afternoon. Cole waited by his patrol vehicle, arms crossed, face cast in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "You'll want to see this yourself," he said, gesturing toward the trail ahead. The two men moved quickly, Cooper trotting behind them with alert eyes. The trail was barely a path at all, just a winding break in the underbrush. Thorns scraped against Dan's coat, and the air grew colder as the canopy thickened overhead. 20 minutes in, they saw it. The cabin sat hunched beneath a ridge of moss-covered rock, its roof sagging, but intact, its windows boarded from the inside. Smoke hadn't curled from its chimney in weeks. A small pile of chopped wood lay abandoned near the front door, the axe still embedded in the stump. Whoever had been here, they left in a hurry, or planned to return. Inside it was cold, dim, and cluttered. The smell of old coffee sweat and wood smoke lingered faintly. Dan moved slowly, scanning the walls first. What he saw made him stop. Pinned across the cabin's planked walls were dozens of handwritten notes. Some were just dates, others were fragments of sentences. One simply read, "Thunderstay, I'll come back." On the small table in the center of the room was a half-crumpled photograph. Dan picked it up carefully. The picture showed Cooper clean alert wearing a service vest, and beside him stood a tall man in fatigues with sun-darkened skin and a calm, focused expression. His eyes seemed almost too still. On the back of the photo, scribbled in thick black ink, Gregory Tan, June 2019. Dan handed the photo to Cole. "That's our man." Cole nodded. "Matches the name from the VA registry we pulled. He served 2 tours. After his discharge, he stopped checking in. VA had him listed as non-responsive since early last year." A small medicine cabinet stood open beside the bed, revealing 3 different prescriptions for PTSD, 2 unopened, 1 half empty. A bottle of sleeping pills lay on the floor, its cap missing. Dan recognized the restlessness in this place, the need to write everything down, the isolation, the withdrawal from order. He'd seen it in friends. He'd fought it in himself. Cooper walked to the corner and sniffed a rumpled sleeping bag. Then, almost as if guided by something deeper, he moved toward the table and sat quietly beside it. Dan followed him and noticed an old leather-bound journal beneath a pile of papers. Inside were entries written with a shaking hand. One page read, "Cooper knows. He always knows. When it gets too loud, he puts his head on my knee. I can't tell anyone. They wouldn't understand. But he does. He listens without judgment." Dan closed the journal, his throat tightening. Back at home that evening, Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes still sleepy from reading. The fire crackled beside her. Cooper had returned with Dan and now lay beside her, head on her leg. Ellie didn't say much. She didn't need to. Earlier that afternoon, while working through an online presentation, her laptop had frozen. The frustration came fast, as it always did, the panic, the racing heart, the overwhelmed silence. And just as the tears started to rise, Cooper had padded over without a sound and laid his head gently across her lap. She'd looked down, startled, and then suddenly calmer. It happened again that evening when Dan raised his voice by accident. Nothing serious, just a dropped mug and a snapped sentence. But even before Ellie could flinch, Cooper was at her side again, offering nothing but presence. She reached down now and brushed his ear with her fingertips. "You do that on purpose, don't you?" she whispered. "You feel it before I do." Dan watched from the kitchen doorway, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. He hadn't told Ellie about Gregory Tan yet. Not fully. Just that Cooper had once belonged to someone who needed him badly. He would tell her soon, but not tonight. That night, Dan opened his own notebook and wrote, "He didn't abandon Cooper. He was trying to protect him from himself." And under that, he added, "We have to find Gregory before the silence takes him completely." The road to Coldwind Lake curved like a scar through the pines, narrow and flanked by cliffs that dropped steeply into mist-filled valleys. Dan Carter gripped the steering wheel tighter as he drove, his mind turning over what Cole had shared the night before. The utility records confirmed that a small cabin near the northern shore of Coldwind had been activated just 4 months ago under the name Gregory Tan. Since then, there'd been no bank activity, no phone calls, and no VA appointments. Just silence. Cooper sat quietly in the passenger seat, eyes fixed out the window, ears twitching occasionally as if sensing something beyond what humans could hear. His golden coat shimmered faintly in the late morning sun that filtered through the tree canopy, a soft contrast to the dark woods around them. Dan glanced over at him. "You remember this place, don't you?" he murmured. Cooper didn't respond, but his tail thudded once against the seat. The cabin came into view, unexpectedly, nestled behind a wall of dense spruce and half buried in fallen needles. It was smaller than Dan had imagined, almost hunched, with a tin chimney rising from one corner and a crooked porch that looked like it might collapse under its own weight. A truck with flat tires sat rusting nearby one window, covered with cardboard. No smoke, no movement, just stillness. Dan parked a few yards away and stepped out cautiously, Cooper following behind him. As they approached, he called out, "Gregory name's Dan Carter. I think we've got something in common." There was no answer, only the wind threading through the trees and the creak of an old rope swing dangling from a nearby pine. Dan stepped onto the porch, noting the sagging boards, the moss-stained door. He knocked. A scraping noise came from within, slow and unsure. Then the door opened a crack. Gregory Tan stood in the dim doorway, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with shaggy hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight he couldn't drop, and his clothes, military surplus pants and a flannel shirt, hung loosely on his frame. His beard was patchy, and there was a tremor in his hand as he held the door frame. Gregory was in his late 30s, once broad-shouldered and proud, now carved down by solitude and guilt. His eyes, dark, sharp, and rimmed with exhaustion, flicked immediately to Cooper. When they did, something inside him seemed to fracture. "Cooper," he whispered. "Oh, God." The dog didn't bark, didn't lunge. He sat still and, watching, head tilted slightly, his amber gaze steady. For a moment, the entire forest seemed to breathe in. "I thought—" Gregory's voice cracked. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was keeping him safe. From me. Dan said nothing. He knew this look, the edges of shame, the retreat from a world too loud, too complicated. He'd seen it in the mirror more than once. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked gently. Gregory stepped aside and motioned him in. The interior of the cabin was sparse, a cot in the corner, a folding table covered with scattered papers, and a wood stove that hadn't been lit in days. A worn military backpack rested beside a pair of muddy boots. On the wall above the cot was a small hand-drawn portrait of Cooper rendered in charcoal, detailed, reverent. Gregory sat slowly in a chair, his hands shaking as he poured cold coffee into a dented mug. "After we came back," he began, "things got bad. The VA gave me meds. I took them, but they didn't quiet the noise. Cooper was the only one who helped. He knew when the shadows came. He always knew." He looked at Dan, eyes suddenly bright with moisture. "But I started seeing things, hearing things. There was one night I thought the house was on fire, but it wasn't. Cooper tried to calm me, but I shoved him away. He cried. That sound, I'll never forget it. I thought I'd hurt him, that I might do worse. So I drove him out to Willow Creek and tied him where I knew someone would find him. I thought I was protecting him from me." Dan sat across from him, arms crossed. He waited, he never ran. He sat there cold starving, but calm, like he believed you'd come back. Gregory bowed his head. Cooper, quiet until now, moved slowly forward and rested his head on Gregory's knee. Gregory froze. Then after a long moment, he let out a choked breath and placed a trembling hand on Cooper's head. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Dan replied softly, Maybe, maybe not, but the dog doesn't care. He just wants you to come back." Back in Pine Grove, Ellie sat at the dining table, her notebook open, the page half filled with careful handwriting. Her teacher had assigned a personal essay titled A Quiet Hero, and she knew instantly who she would write about. She described the day Cooper arrived, the way he watched the room before stepping in, how he never barked, only listened. She wrote about the day her laptop crashed, and she cried not loud, but in that shaking, silent way she always hid, and Cooper had placed his head on her lap. No one else had ever known when to do that. Her hand moved faster now as the words poured out. He doesn't wear a cape. He doesn't fight with fists, but he knows what fear sounds like. And somehow he knows how to make it quiet again. When she finished, she closed the notebook gently and placed her hand on Cooper's old service vest folded neatly beside her, her quiet hero. The first time Gregory walked through the gates of the Pine Valley Veterans Recovery Center, he didn't look at anyone. Shoulders hunched, eyes downcast beneath the brim of a battered cap, he moved like someone carrying a burden that had grown heavier with every mile. The center sat on the gentle slope of a valley northeast of Pine Grove, surrounded by open fields and tree-lined trails that rustled with the breath of November wind. Built with red cedar and stone, the place didn't feel like a hospital. It felt like a place where silence was allowed, but not left unchecked. Cooper walked beside him without a leash, just as he had once done in combat zones. Though Gregory had not spoken a word since agreeing to come, it was Cooper who led the way, not by force, not by command, but by the quiet presence of trust. Dr. Leah Rasmussen, the clinical director, waited just inside the lobby. A tall woman in her early 40s with auburn hair, pulled into a low braid, and eyes that missed very little. She had a calm strength about her. She wore boots caked in field dirt and a sweater that looked like it had been knitted by a patient. Her voice was steady, measured, kind. "Gregory," she said as he entered, "welcome." Gregory gave a curt nod. "And Cooper," she added with a smile toward the dog who sat immediately at her feet, tail wagging once. Dan and Ellie stood off to the side watching. Ellie clutched Cooper's vest, folded in her hands like a flag, not wanting to let it go, even if just for a few days. Gregory hadn't looked at them either, but Dan didn't expect him to. Not yet. "He's not ready," Ellie whispered. "No," Dan agreed, "but he came. That's step one." Over the next week, Cooper remained at the center, a silent shadow to Gregory's reluctant routine. The staff respected the unspoken boundaries. Gregory attended sessions, at first only physically present, arms crossed, gaze distant. But Cooper stayed close during group circles, always lying beside him, often placing his head on Gregory's boot. No barking, no theatrics, just presence. Gregory didn't speak until day 6. During a quiet afternoon walk through the East Trail, Dr. Rasmussen gently asked, "Do you remember what it felt like?" When Cooper first helped you through a panic, Gregory stopped. Leaves crunched underfoot. The air was cold enough to fog his breath. It didn't feel like anything he said, voice rough from disuse. That was the point. Everything just stopped. The next day, he asked for a journal. At home in Pine Grove, Ellie rearranged the corner of the living room where Cooper had slept. She placed a photo of him next to a hand-drawn sketch and added a note. "You'll be back soon." She wasn't the same girl who had avoided speaking in class and kept her drawings hidden. Her teacher had read the essay on Cooper aloud in front of the class, something that once would have mortified her. But now she sat taller, knowing she had written something true. Meanwhile, Dan had begun his own quiet transformation. One foggy morning, he visited Helen Moore's clinic, not with a dog, but with 2 cups of coffee in hand. Helen looked up from her charting, surprised. "Well, well. I thought you only existed in the woods." Dan chuckled, the sound catching him off guard. "Thought I'd see if you were still the only person in town who could tell me what I'm feeling before I know it myself." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You're feeling guilty." Maybe, he admitted, or just tired of not feeling at all. They sat on the bench outside her office sipping coffee, while the town passed by slowly in muffled autumn colors. "You know," she said. "After a pause, I used to think grief was something to solve, but it's not. It's something to carry." Dan nodded. "I've been carrying it wrong, I think." She smiled, the kind that made people feel safe. "You've still got time to shift your grip." Back at the center, Gregory's progress was steady but cautious. In his journal, he wrote lines like, "Today, Cooper sat beside a man crying. He didn't move, just stayed. And sometimes healing doesn't come with words. It comes with silence that isn't empty." Dr. Rasmussen encouraged him to read these aloud in group. He refused at first, then one day he did. That afternoon, Ellie and Dan returned for a scheduled visit. They waited on a bench near the garden where the sun filtered softly through thinning trees. Gregory emerged slowly from the center's back patio, Cooper walking at his side. "Hi," Ellie said, standing. She didn't rush. "We missed you." Gregory looked at her and then at Dan, his expression unreadable but softer than before. "I kept the vest," Ellie added, offering it carefully. "But I think he wants to wear it again." Gregory took the vest and knelt. Cooper sat patiently as it was strapped on, almost ceremonially. His tail wagged once, then again, a little faster. Gregory rose. He waited, he said. Dan nodded. "He knew you would come back." And in that quiet clearing, no one spoke for a long while, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence this time was shared. In the soft golden hush of early December, the Pine Valley Veterans Recovery Center began each day the same way, coffee brewing in the common room. Gentle morning walks along frost-dusted trails in the familiar rhythm of slow healing. For Gregory Tan, those quiet mornings had become a kind of sanctuary, a way to orient his mind before the memories arrived. He no longer flinched at footsteps behind him. He no longer avoided mirrors. Each day wasn't perfect, but it was grounded, and that grounding came in part from the figure that still followed him through each session. Each step Cooper. Cooper freshly groomed and wearing a new vest embroidered with golden thread, certified service companion dog. The badge had been delivered just the week before, complete with a laminated ID card and a packet of registration forms from the VA. It wasn't just a formality, it was a restoration of duty. Cooper now sat beside Gregory, not just as a friend, but as a working partner, once again trained and trusted to bring peace where words could not. Gregory's newest therapy came in the form of charcoal and silence. The center's art room was tucked behind the garden wing, where filtered light fell on worn stools and paint-splattered easels. The volunteer art therapist, Ms. Clara Wilkes, was a short, silver-haired woman in her late 60s, always wearing long linen tunics and mismatched earrings. She spoke little, preferring to let the room do the talking. Clara had spent years teaching art in inner-city schools before retiring to the countryside. After losing her own son to war, she had found purpose again by helping veterans process the invisible. She recognized the pattern's tight, tense sketches that eventually loosened, colors shifting from gray to ochre, lines that stopped trembling. Gregory had drawn Cooper again, but this time, the dog's eyes weren't watchful, they were peaceful. Above the sketch, Gregory had scrawled, "He waited for me to stop running." Back in Pine Grove, the winter sun spilled through the windows of Evergreen Middle School, where Ellie Carter stood on stage, her paper trembling slightly in her hands. The gymnasium was packed with students, parents, and teachers for the annual Voices from the Heart Assembly, a tradition started years ago to help young students speak about things that mattered most. Ellie hadn't told Dan she was planning to read her essay aloud. She had barely told her teacher she wanted to do it, but when her name was called, she didn't hesitate. "My name is Ellie Carter," she began, her voice small but sure. "And I want to tell you about my hero." She read about the dog who came into her life unexpectedly, who didn't need to speak to be understood. About the first time he laid his head on her knee, and how the anxiety that had once wrapped around her chest like a chain suddenly began to unravel. She read about how he helped someone else come home too. The gym was quiet when she finished. A few teachers dabbed their eyes. Ellie's classmates, once unaware of the quiet girl with the sketchbook, now looked at her differently. In the back row, Dan sat frozen, hand pressed over his mouth. Pride sat heavy in his chest, not loud and swelling, but soft and reverent. Later that afternoon at Helen Moore's clinic, Dan sat across from her on the porch steps. They had fallen into a habit of coffee every Thursday, a quiet ritual that didn't require grand confessions. But today, Helen had something new. You ever think about starting something, she asked, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear? A group, maybe. Veterans. Informal. Just a place where they can talk. Be heard. Dan raised an eyebrow. I haven't led anything since my ranger days, and even then, trees listen better than people. Helen gave a dry chuckle. That's exactly why you'd be good at it. He looked down at his calloused hands. I'm not a therapist. You don't have to be. You've seen the dark. You made it out. You're someone they'd listen to. Dan thought of Gregory, of Cooper, of the years he had buried his own grief under task chores silence. Maybe being useful again wasn't about fixing anyone. Maybe it was just about sitting beside them long enough until they didn't feel broken anymore. He nodded slowly. All right, I'll give it a try. That evening, Dan returned home to find Ellie and Cooper sprawled on the living room floor. She had scattered art supplies around her like petals sketching something she didn't hide this time. He looked over her shoulder. It was a drawing of Cooper seated between two chairs, one empty one filled by a man who looked an awful lot like him. Above the chairs were small lanterns glowing softly as if lit by memory. Is that me? Dan asked. Ellie nodded. He helped us both. Dan sat down beside them, rubbing Cooper's ears. The dog leaned in, tail thumping gently. Ellie leaned her head against Dan's arm. Maybe Healing didn't bark, but it stayed. It waited, and sometimes it came wearing golden fur. It was late spring in Willow Creek. The forests were alive again, breathing softly under budding canopies of green, and the air smelled of pine and promise. Along the familiar trail near the eastern ridge, Cooper walked beside Ellie, no leash, no command, just in step with her, as if he could hear the rhythm of her heart and matched it perfectly. A year had passed since the first time Dan had found the golden retriever tied to a tree in those same woods ribs showing eyes dim with exhaustion. Now Cooper's coat shimmered with health, his gait steady and strong. The sadness in his eyes had been replaced by something else, recognition, quiet duty, a knowing peace. Ellie, now 13, carried herself differently. A little taller still, with her soft brown curls and freckled cheeks, but her eyes held more light. Confidence had taken root, watered by experience and quiet healing. She wore a green hoodie printed with a paw print logo, the emblem of the Bridge and Bark Project, a local youth mental health volunteer group inspired by her and Cooper's story. They reached a wooden bench built by volunteers near the creek. It bore a small plaque that read, "To those who waited for the quiet to return." Ellie sat down and Cooper lay beside her head, resting on her sneaker. She pulled out her sketchbook, not hidden anymore, and began sketching the water's movement. Not far from there, Gregory Tan stood on the porch of his new cabin, one-story modest with wide windows facing the trees. He had moved back just 2 months earlier, choosing a place between the center and the people who had brought him home. His beard was trimmed, now his posture straighter. He still carried shadows in his eyes, but they were softer now, shared instead of hidden. He held a mug of tea, a daily habit Clara Wilkes had insisted on. Clara still visited once a month, checking in with her own version of therapy, quiet conversation, over charcoal, and stories painted without brushes. Gregory had a corner of his small living room dedicated to his art now. One sketch framed showed Cooper curled between Ellie and Dan on the porch steps. Above it the words, "Home doesn't bark, it listens." Gregory saw Dan approaching through the trees. He still moved like a ranger, purposeful but easy. He wore his worn flannel shirt and a faded green ball cap, a trail map folded into his back pocket. "Morning," Dan said, stopping at the porch. Gregory offered the extra chair. "Tea," Dan grunted. "Still don't trust leaves and water." Gregory smiled. That was new. He smiled more now. They sat for a while watching the breeze shake the trees. Cooper would be arriving that evening for the weekend part of the shared rhythm they'd created. Weekdays with Ellie and her school schedule. Weekends here, walking the ridge, helping Gregory give talks at the VA. Curled at his feet during veteran meetups. Ellie said the school wants her to speak at the state assembly, Dan said, after a while. "She'll do great," Gregory replied. Dan nodded. "Yeah, I just wish her grandma could see her now. You talk about her a lot lately." Dan's face softened. "I used to avoid looking at her picture. Couldn't even walk past it. But the other day, I hung a new photo beside hers, one of Ellie and one of Cooper between them." Gregory looked at him. "You gave him a place." Dan nodded. "He earned it. Back in town, the community center buzzed with a new kind of energy. The Bridge and Bark project had grown. What started as a support circle for kids dealing with anxiety had expanded to include veterans, teachers, and parents. Weekly walks were organized art sessions held in the same sunlit library where Ellie first met Martha, the retired nurse, who now acted as the group's mentor and gentle guide. Martha, now officially part of the group's leadership, stood outside the center that afternoon, pinning a flyer to the board Community Day, story songs, and service dogs. Cooper's face was on the poster, tail wagging, head slightly tilted, wearing his service vest and a bandana that read, "Here to listen." He'd become something more than a dog to the town. He was a bridge between past and present, grief and recovery, silence and understanding. At home, Ellie helped Dan prepare dinner. She chopped carrots while he stirred stew, and Cooper lay near the hearth, eyes half closed. The smell of thyme and roasted vegetables filled the cabin. Grandpa Ellie asked, pausing, "Do you think Cooper remembers that first day when you found him?" Dan looked over at the dog, who now watched them with one eye open. "I think he remembers the feeling," Dan said, "of being found." Ellie smiled. "Me too." Later after dinner, Gregory arrived to pick up Cooper. Ellie greeted him at the door and knelt to hug her friend. "Be good, okay?" she whispered to Cooper, and keep reminding him he's not alone. Gregory gave Dan a quiet nod and reached down to clip on Cooper's vest. The dog stood tail wagging, ready for duty, for comfort, for whatever came next. "See you Sunday," Ellie said, waving. "See you," Gregory replied. "Thanks for sharing him." As they disappeared into the dusk, Dan stood with Ellie on the porch. The stars blinked through the deepening sky, and the forest hummed with the low rhythm of night. "He's not just your dog anymore," Dan said. Ellie leaned into his side. "I know. He's everyone's. But most of all, he was home." Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with thunder or miracles written in the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly on four paws, with patient eyes and a heart that chooses to stay. Cooper wasn't just a dog. He was an answer, a silent prayer returned in golden fur. Through him, broken hearts found rhythm, again lost souls found their way back, and those who had forgotten how to feel remembered what it meant to be seen. The way he waited, the way he forgave, is more than instinct. It's grace, and perhaps that grace came not only from training, but from something deeper, a gift only God can place in the heart of a creature so faithful, so gentle, and so enduring. In our busy lives, we often overlook the quiet ways that God works through people who listen, through animals who understand, and through second chances we didn't know we needed. This story reminds us that even when we feel abandoned, unseen, or too far gone, someone or something might be on the trail back to us already. So, if this touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Don't forget to comment your thoughts, subscribe for more stories that lift and heal, and say a prayer for all the silent heroes still out there waiting. If you believe in the power of quiet miracles and in a God who never leaves our side, comment Amen below. And may He bless you with the kind of healing that doesn't bark but stays.